Bitcoiners are angry right now, and not just a little bit angry, but based off the mood data that I've been diving into, they're one of the angriest they've ever been in the entire history of the network. Crowds get angry, something interesting happens. Not only do they feel worse, but they actually think worse too, and in relatively predictable and expected ways. Narratives don't just spread based on how truthful they are. One of the reasons certain stories take off and others just fall flat is because of how moody the general market is and what kind of state they're currently in mentally. So that's the lens I want to look through here. And the very specific mood lens I want to first start with is anger, which is what we're looking at here. This is the Bitcoin price over time, and we're looking at plebs or smaller Bitcoin accounts and the amount of anger in their language over time. And you can see recently we're in one of the longest, most angry regimes in the history of Bitcoin. And I want to give you an analogy here to think about this. So for a minute, imagine you're driving to work. You have some big presentation, you're drinking some lukewarm coffee, there's just stresses of your life. And then somebody cuts you off in traffic, you slam on your brakes and you spill on yourself, and you just like start racing through your mind, thinking about how much of an asshole this person is. You start building up a story of how they were like way more focused on themselves than you. You start immediately thinking they have crazy different political beliefs, and you just go down a whole spiral. But then you catch up to them in traffic and you eventually pass him and you see it's a young dad with two crazy toddlers in the back of the car screaming at him. And you realize that the anger didn't just make you think worse, it actually made you start to build up conspiracies or think in a different, more negative lens. This guy wasn't malicious, he wasn't reckless, he was simply a young dad who's dealing with the stresses of his life and they just collided with yours in a moment. See, anger poisons your ability to think in a very specific and predictable way. And this applies not only personally, but to broader markets as well. Just like your logical reasoning deteriorates when somebody cuts you off in traffic, so too does the average market participant get worse at thinking when the entire market is angry or if price is down. In these sorts of environments, specifically when there's high levels of anger, people are looking for villains to blame for the problems. And that's why we're looking at paper Bitcoin, because the mention rate of this thing, which is what we're looking at over time across the last couple years or so, it comes up a little bit higher last summer when paper Bitcoin was a big thing, but it's really peaking lately in the last 6 months when price has been consistently down and the anger levels are the highest we've seen in the Bitcoin ecosystem for quite some time. These certain narratives are given more credence in these sorts of negative environments. Now we're looking at quantum computing over almost the exact same time horizon, and immediately you'll see the correlation here. Since price has been down and people have been consistently angry, the rate of mention of this thing has been going way up. And this is not to say that there isn't some relative level of risk here, just that people are a little bit more focused on this risk and want to find somebody to blame for the price action when it's down. The crowd's willingness to obsess about a topic is not a constant. In a regime full of anger or fear like we're seeing right now, people are disproportionately likely to overweight the probability of quantum being a real threat. This isn't to say there isn't some probability spectrum that the quantum risk lives on, but that in general, in times like now, people are heavily overweight this probability. On the flip side, we'll look at optimism, which is the mirror opposite to anger in a lot of ways. You'll see that at certain periods of time, specifically when we approach new all-time highs, people get disproportionately optimistic. The kind of actions that happen here are people taking on disproportional amounts of leverage and making very rash price predictions and going really long the orange coin at precisely the wrong time. And just like with anger, there are specific psychological predispositions that one has when they're under the influence of optimism. Imagine, again, our hypothetical scenario when you're on your way to work to give a presentation. Let's say you just knock that presentation out of the park. The client is commending you for how good of a job you did, and you're shaking hands about stuff. Immediately, your brain starts calculating the money that you're going to spend if the deal closes and things go well. This is your mind under the influence of optimism. You are a little bit too positive looking towards the future at precisely the wrong time, typically in markets. Your view of the future shifts in real time. Instead of calculating the probabilities that things go bad or looking at some of these like more dangerous outcomes, you immediately start looking at the most idealistic version of the future. And this happens across the broader market too, and is measured in this language data. A really common example of this is the strategic Bitcoin reserve, which although we did get some legislation around, the persistent nation state buyer that people were predicting just did not happen. And you'll look that right during the periods of the most optimism, people disproportionately were talking about this narrative over time. We're currently feeling different moods. We either overweight or underweight the likelihood of these different outcomes. If there's a 1% chance of some negative outcome with Bitcoin happening, and we're very angry, we overweight that to a 2% chance or a 5% chance. The inverse is true during euphoric bull markets, where we might give it a 0.5% chance or 0.2 if we're just extremely optimistic. Everything lives on a probabilistic spectrum, but our emotions around it really mutate how much the market gives weight to any of these narratives. We're going to close with what might be my favorite narrative here that reflects both of these two things. But before I do, I just want to say, if you have a different cohort that you'd like me to look into or a narrative you'd like me to examine, please leave a comment and I'll dive in as soon as I can. The 4-year cycle. This one has been arguably one of the most persistent narratives across Bitcoin, which is why it's so interesting to analyze in this way. So first, we'll see that it spiked around November of 2024. People are using this narrative coupled with high levels of optimism. They were talking about this, about how we're going to see euphoric blow-off tops, and they were using this narrative as a way to make their bullish price predictions seem more realistic. We saw very little action on this narrative for a while, and it's really started to ramp up around the end of 2025, early 2026, and it stayed persistently high. The difference here all comes down to the context of the mood. So right now, over the last 6 months or so, we've seen one of the most angry regimes in all of Bitcoin. There are headwinds of anger in the narrative space, right? So we have seen a lot more mentions of this thing, but it's all under the context of high conviction language and people well being extremely angry about this thing. And this is particularly interesting to me because if there was ever a time to fade an extremely popular narrative that's gaining traction, it's when people are disproportionately emotionally impacted by these negative emotions like fear. See, FUD has a tendency to show up at the exact worst periods of time. And right now, the broader crypto community thinks that we're in a 4-year cycle and that moods are bad and anger is persistent. But they're so confident about this, and this is very unique to the current market environment. Because of all this FUD, a great deal of people across the crypto community are completely offsides right now and are very confidently planning to buy back Bitcoin lower. They could very well be right. I've been wrong repeatedly about things in Bitcoin, but what I think is so interesting right now is how confident they are about it and how quickly moods might shift here. So, for example, we're seeing high pessimism. If we start to see any kind of upward price inflection, this very quickly goes to optimism. The anger shifts into joy, perhaps. And all this boredom that we've seen very quickly goes into excitement. Because of how disproportionately negative moods are right now, if this does shift in a meaningful way, it's likely to be a very violent shift, where the narrative and the story that we've been telling ourselves for a decade plus in Bitcoin could deteriorate from underneath our feet. These people understand Bitcoin but are completely offsides, and they're likely to buy back, but rather than the 40K price target, it's somewhere much, much higher. Look, I'm not formally predicting this. Anything could happen here, but all I'm saying is that if there is a positive news story or anything like that that breaks right now and shifts Bitcoin back up to higher price bands again, it's likely to really challenge some of these long-running narratives, and doing so under an emotional regime that's very, very novel for Bitcoin. If there was ever a time to fade the most long-standing narrative in Bitcoin, it would certainly be during one of the longest running periods of high anger, fear, and low moods. It's impossible to predict the future, and just because people are angry or annoyed right now doesn't mean the price action is going to do anything. This is just a really unique lens through which to look at the Bitcoin price action and see what kind of narratives are more likely to gain additional weight comparatively to others. That's all I got for you today. If you want to look through some of these charts in more detail, you can check out my Substack. There's a link in my profile. If that's still not enough for you, feel free to shoot me a DM and we can talk about some of the custom narrative and sentiment analysis stuff that I've been into.